Welcome to WWO Heroic Tales, where true stories of courage, sacrifice, and extraordinary heroism come alive from the darkest days of World War II. Join us as we uncover the untold moments that shaped history. The year is 2000. Berlin is a city still reinventing itself, a decade after the wall fell. The air is thick with the promise of a new, unified Europe. Germany, at the heart of the continent, is led by a coalition of the Social Democrats and the Green Party, a government driven by an idealistic vision of openness and reconciliation. In the corridors of the Auswärtiges Amt, the German Foreign Ministry, a new philosophy is taking shape. The Cold War is a memory, and the goal is now to bridge the remaining divides with Eastern Europe. The focus is on outreach, on building trust, and on dismantling the bureaucratic walls that had separated peoples for generations. This wasn't about military strategy or geopolitical chess. It was about people. It was a belief that freedom of movement was a fundamental right and a powerful tool for diplomacy. Foreign Minister Joschka Fischer, a charismatic and influential figure of the Green Party, championed this vision. His ministry sought to project a new German identity, less rigid, more welcoming, a partner to its Eastern neighbors. The guiding principle was that lowering barriers would foster democracy, strengthen civil society, and tie countries like Ukraine closer to the West. This was the ideological soil in which a fateful policy would grow. The intention was noble: to make it easier for ordinary Ukrainians, for students, business people, and families to experience Germany and the West. The old visa procedures were seen as relics of a paranoid past, cumbersome and mistrustful. A change was needed, a bold gesture to prove that the Iron Curtain was truly gone, not just physically, but in the mindset of diplomats and bureaucrats. This policy would be a symbol of Germany's commitment to a wider, freer Europe. The mood in Berlin was optimistic, forward-looking, but deep within the complex machinery of state, where policy meets reality, the seeds of a massive, unforeseen crisis were being sown. An idealistic dream was about to collide with a harsh and cynical world, a world that was expert at finding and exploiting the smallest crack in any system. The policy shift coalesced into a formal directive, soon to be known infamously as the Volmer Decree. Named after Ludger Volmer, a fellow Green Party politician and Minister of State in the Foreign Ministry, this document was the legislative instrument of the government's new philosophy. Issued in the year 2000, it sent a clear and unambiguous message to German diplomatic missions abroad, particularly those in Eastern Europe. The instructions were deceptively simple. Consular officials were to facilitate travel freedom. They were instructed to give applicants the benefit of the doubt. The core of the decree was a fundamental reversal of long-standing consular practice. For decades, the burden of proof had been on the visa applicant to demonstrate a credible reason for travel and a firm intention to return home. This was the bedrock of immigration control. The Volmer Decree effectively dismantled this safeguard. It instructed embassies to default to approval. According to a later investigation by the Cologne Criminal Court, The new policy systematically removed the key mechanisms designed to prevent visa abuse. The requirement for exhaustive checks on an applicant's financial stability and their travel intentions was relaxed to the point of being non-existent. The decree fostered an atmosphere where questioning an application was discouraged. The directive from Berlin was clear. In case of doubt, issue the visa. This shift was not merely a procedural tweak. It was a radical overhaul of the entire visa issuance system. Consular officers, trained to be gatekeepers, were now being told to be facilitators, to open the gates wide. They were pressured to view visa applicants not as potential risks, but as welcome visitors. The policy was driven by the political desire to appear open and friendly, especially towards Ukraine. Berlin wanted to send a powerful signal of partnership, but in doing so, it stripped its own officials of the tools they needed to perform their most basic function, ensuring that those entering the country, and by extension the entire Schengen area, were doing so for legitimate reasons. The decree was a top-down mandate, born from political idealism in the capital, but it would have its most profound impact on the ground, in the crowded waiting rooms of embassies hundreds of miles away. The epicenter of the crisis was the German embassy in Kyiv, Ukraine. Almost overnight, the consulate was transformed from a measured diplomatic outpost into a chaotic processing factory. The moment the Volmer Decree came into effect, the floodgates opened. Word spread like wildfire through Ukraine. Getting a visa to Germany was now easier than ever before. The embassy was inundated. Long lines of applicants snaked around the block from dawn until dusk, a river of humanity flowing towards what seemed like a guaranteed entry into Western Europe. Inside, the consular staff were overwhelmed. The sheer volume was staggering. At its peak, the Kyiv embassy, along with other affected missions, was processing between 10,000 and 15,000 visa applications every single month. The soundscape of the consulate became a constant, percussive rhythm of rubber stamps hitting paper, a frantic, relentless tempo set by the crushing demand. Staff worked in a state of perpetual triage, struggling to keep up with the mountains of passports and forms piling up on their desks. The directive from Berlin to approve almost automatically meant there was no time for due diligence. The nuanced, investigative work of a consular officer, interviewing applicants, verifying documents, assessing credibility, was replaced by a purely mechanical function. It was an assembly line for visas. The pressure was immense, not just from the workload but from the political mandate itself. To deny a visa was to go against the spirit of the new policy, to be seen as obstructive. Officials were caught in an impossible bind. Their professional training screamed caution, but their instructions demanded compliance. The atmosphere was thick with tension and a growing sense of dread. Experienced diplomats saw the system being abused in real time, but felt powerless to stop it. They were witnessing the systematic dismantling of border security, stamp by stamp, passport by passport. The waiting rooms were a microcosm of hope and desperation, but for the staff behind the reinforced glass, it was the start of a nightmare. They were the unwilling architects of a crisis they could see coming, but were ordered not to prevent. Where systemic weakness exists, exploitation is never far behind. The relaxed visa policy created a perfect opportunity, a golden ticket for organized crime. Sophisticated international syndicates quickly recognized the potential for immense profit. The German visa became a commodity, and they became its most efficient distributors. These criminal networks established a thriving black market, turning the idealistic policy into a cynical and lucrative enterprise. Their methods were brazen and effective. They produced high-quality forged documents on an industrial scale. Fake invitations from non-existent German companies, complete with official-looking letterheads and contact details that led nowhere, flooded the system. They concocted elaborate backstories for applicants, coaching them on what to say if, by some small chance, they were asked a question. For a fee, anyone could acquire a complete package that virtually guaranteed a Schengen visa. This was not just about helping people cross borders. It was about human trafficking. These syndicates smuggled migrants into Germany and from there, across the open borders of the European Union. They were feeding a vast underground economy of illegal labor and, in some cases, facilitating more sinister criminal activity. The visa was the key that unlocked the door to Europe, and these criminal groups held a master set. The sheer volume of applications at embassies like the one in Kyiv provided the perfect cover. With consular staff overwhelmed and under orders to approve applications quickly, there was little chance that forged documents would be detected. The syndicates knew the system better than the officials trying to manage it. They knew which consulates were under the most pressure and targeted them relentlessly. The policy designed to promote freedom and openness was perversely twisted into a tool for exploitation and illicit gain. While politicians in Berlin spoke of building bridges, criminal gangs were using those same bridges to transport their human cargo, profiting from the desperation of migrants and the naivety of a government. The German Foreign Ministry had inadvertently created a state-sanctioned loophole, and the criminal underworld was pouring through it. Within the walls of the German Foreign Ministry's outposts, a quiet rebellion was brewing. The individuals on the front lines, the career consular officials, were the first to witness the catastrophic consequences of the Volmer Decree. They were seasoned professionals, trained to spot inconsistencies, to read between the lines of an application, and to uphold the security of the Schengen border. Now, they were being forced to ignore their instincts and their training. But not all of them stayed silent. A number of courageous officials began to sound the alarm. From Kyiv, from Moscow, and from other embassies across Eastern Europe, a stream of urgent warnings began to flow back to Berlin. These were not vague complaints. They were detailed, evidence-based reports. They documented the surge in applications accompanied by identical, boilerplate invitation letters. They flagged the sudden appearance of tour groups where no one knew their itinerary and travel agencies that seemed to exist only on paper. They reported clear evidence of forged bank statements, fake employment records, and the overt coaching of applicants waiting in line. These whistleblowers described a system in complete meltdown. They warned that the policy was being systematically exploited by human smuggling rings, and that Germany was facilitating a wave of illegal immigration into the heart of Europe. They pleaded with their superiors at the Foreign Ministry to reinstate the old safeguards, to give them back the authority to properly scrutinize applications. Their memos, however, seemed to vanish into a bureaucratic void. The complaints were largely ignored, dismissed, or sidelined. The political leadership in Berlin was committed to its policy of openness and was unreceptive to news that would undermine it. The officials who spoke out were often seen as obstructionists, as relics of an old, less enlightened era. One report from an official who explicitly warned of the connection to organized crime was notoriously buried. The message from the top was clear: stick to the new guidelines. This created a profound crisis of conscience for many diplomats. They had sworn an oath to serve the German state and protect its interests, yet they were being ordered to implement a policy that they believed was doing profound damage. Their ignored warnings represent the tragic what if of the scandal, the moment when the disaster could have been averted had anyone in power been willing to listen. For years, the crisis festered behind the closed doors of German embassies. But a secret of this magnitude could not be contained forever. In late 2004 and early 2005, the dam of silence finally broke. The scandal erupted into the public consciousness, not from a single leak, but from a convergence of events that made the problem impossible to ignore. The initial trigger was a criminal investigation in the city of Cologne. Local authorities, probing an unrelated case, stumbled upon a massive human trafficking ring. As they unraveled the network, they discovered that its entire business model was built on the easy acquisition of German tourist visas. This court case provided the first official, undeniable evidence linking the lax visa policy directly to organized crime. Simultaneously, German media outlets began their own investigations. Journalists, tipped off by frustrated insiders and law enforcement sources, started publishing explosive reports. Newspapers ran front-page stories with headlines detailing a visa scandal and open doors for the mafia. They painted a damning picture of a foreign ministry that had lost control of the nation's borders. The public was shocked. The story had all the elements of a major political drama. Good intentions gone awry, warnings from the front lines being ignored, and the specter of organized crime exploiting government policy. The political opposition, led by the Christian Democratic Union, CDU, seized on the issue. They accused the government of gross negligence and of jeopardizing national and European security. What had been an internal bureaucratic issue was now a full-blown political firestorm. The Foreign Ministry, initially defensive, found itself backpedaling as more and more evidence came to light. The trickle of information became a flood. The sheer numbers were staggering. Hundreds of thousands of visas issued under the relaxed rules, with an unknown number obtained fraudulently. The scandal was no longer a secret held by a few dozen diplomats. It was the subject of fierce debate in the German parliament, the Bundestag, and a growing source of public outrage. The turning point had been reached. The affair was out in the open, and the demand for accountability would lead directly to the highest levels of the German government. The political fallout culminated in a dramatic showdown in the heart of German democracy. Foreign Minister Joschka Fischer, one of the country's most popular and powerful politicians, was summoned to testify before a special investigative committee of the Bundestag. This was the climax of the scandal, a moment of intense public scrutiny. The hearing room was packed with journalists, politicians, and aides. The atmosphere was electric, charged with political tension. The flashing of cameras created a staccato rhythm as Fischer, the architect of the Green Party's rise to power, took his seat to face a barrage of questions. For hours, he was interrogated. Members of the opposition methodically laid out the timeline of the crisis. The implementation of the Volmer Decree, the ignored warnings from consular staff, and the devastating evidence of exploitation by criminal gangs. They demanded to know who was responsible. Why were the red flags missed? Did political ideology blind the foreign ministry to the obvious risks? Fischer was in the fight of his political life. His defense was a mixture of accepting general political responsibility while deflecting direct blame for the failures of implementation. He argued that the policy's intent was correct and that the goal of opening up to the East was a noble one. He maintained that he was not aware of the scale of the abuse until it became public, suggesting a failure of communication within the vast bureaucratic structure of his ministry. He told the committee that it was a case of a well-meaning policy being overwhelmed by an unanticipated criminal onslaught. However, his opponents were relentless. They presented internal memos and testimony from sidelined officials that suggested the ministry's leadership had been warned, or at the very least, should have known about the chaos unfolding in its embassies. The interrogation was a grueling affair, a piece of high-stakes political theater broadcast across the nation. While Fischer survived the hearing and withstood the calls for his resignation, the event took a heavy toll. His reputation as a pragmatic and effective statesman was damaged. The image of him, under the harsh lights of the committee room, defending a policy that had spiraled so disastrously out of control, became the defining image of the entire affair. The scandal had reached the very top. The shockwaves of the German visa affair radiated far beyond Berlin. The scandal created a significant diplomatic crisis within the European Union, straining relationships and exposing deep vulnerabilities in the continent's shared security architecture. The Schengen Agreement, a cornerstone of European integration, is built on mutual trust. Each member state trusts the others to diligently police the common external border. Germany's unilateral decision to relax its visa procedures without consulting its partners was seen as a profound breach of that trust. Neighboring countries, particularly Austria and Poland, began to register a noticeable increase in the number of migrants crossing into their territories from Germany. These were individuals who had entered the Schengen area with German-issued visas but without proper vetting. The interior ministers of other EU states were furious. They felt that Germany had, through its negligence, exported a security problem to the rest of the Union. Diplomatic channels, usually reserved for polite cooperation, became conduits for anger and frustration. In Brussels, at meetings of EU officials, German representatives faced a chorus of criticism. They were accused of undermining the integrity of the entire visa system. The affair provided ammunition to Eurosceptics across the continent, who pointed to it as a prime example of how one country's irresponsible policy could endanger everyone. The controversy forced a continent-wide conversation about the security of the Schengen zone. It led to calls for greater harmonization of visa policies and more robust oversight mechanisms to prevent a similar crisis from happening again. For Germany, the diplomatic cost was high. A nation that prided itself on its reliability and adherence to rules was now seen as the weak link in Europe's border security. The scandal tarnished the country's reputation and created a lingering sense of mistrust among its closest allies. The idealistic goal of using visas as a tool of soft power had backfired spectacularly, creating not goodwill, but resentment and division within the European family. Beyond the high-level politics and diplomatic fallout, the German visa affair carried a significant human cost. The policy, intended to empower individuals, ultimately left many vulnerable to exploitation. The thousands of migrants who paid exorbitant fees to criminal syndicates were often trapped in a cycle of debt and abuse upon their arrival in Europe. They were the pawns in a much larger game, their hopes for a better life commodified by traffickers who profited from a broken system. They arrived in a foreign land with no support network, often forced into illegal labor to pay off the cost of their journey, their legal status precarious at best. On an institutional level, the scandal inflicted deep and lasting damage on the German Foreign Ministry. Public trust in one of the country's most respected institutions was severely undermined. The affair created a perception of a ministry that was either incompetent or, worse, willing to sacrifice national security for political ideology. Inside the ministry itself, morale plummeted. The honest, hard-working consular officials who had tried to prevent the disaster felt betrayed and demoralized. Their expertise had been ignored, and their warnings had gone unheeded. The Cologne Criminal Court's findings were a formal indictment of the policy's failure. The court concluded that the Volmer Decree had not just inadvertently created a loophole. It had actively and intentionally removed the very safeguards that were essential for preventing visa abuse. This was not an accident. It was a result of deliberate policy choices. The verdict laid bare the institutional arrogance that had led to the crisis, a belief among policymakers in Berlin that they knew better than the professionals on the ground. The affair exposed a fundamental weakness in governance, the dangerous disconnect between the architects of policy and those responsible for its implementation. It was a stark lesson in how even the most well-intentioned plans can unravel when they ignore the complexities of reality and the predictable opportunism of those who operate in the shadows. The 2005 German visa affair did not simply fade away. It cast a long shadow over European politics and policy for years to come. Its legacy is a cautionary tale, a powerful case study taught in schools of diplomacy and public administration about the perils of idealism untempered by pragmatism. The scandal fundamentally altered Germany's approach to migration and border security, leading to a tightening of visa regulations and a renewed emphasis on security checks. The era of in case of doubt, approve was definitively over, replaced by a more cautious and skeptical posture. The affair became a recurring reference point in all subsequent debates about immigration, security, and the integrity of the Schengen area. Whenever a new migration crisis emerged, the memory of the visa scandal was invoked as a warning against lax enforcement and uncontrolled borders. It highlighted a persistent vulnerability in Europe's visa systems, a weakness that would be exploited again. Years later, a similar cash for visa scandal would rock Poland, revealing that the lessons of 2005 had not been fully learned. The Polish case, involving allegations of consular officials taking bribes to issue visas, echoed the German affair in its demonstration of how easily national visa systems could be corrupted, with continent-wide consequences. These recurring scandals show that the challenge of balancing openness with security remains one of the most difficult for modern states. The 2005 visa affair serves as a permanent reminder that loopholes, whether created by negligence or corruption, will inevitably be found and exploited. It forced a painful but necessary reckoning within Germany about the responsibilities that come with being a central power in Europe. The dream of a borderless continent, the affair proved, depends entirely on the strength and integrity of its external frontiers. When one nation's gate is left unguarded, the security of the entire community is put at risk. Thank you for joining WWWO Heroic Tales. Through the stories of brave souls from World War II, we honor their memory and keep their legacy alive for history and generations to come.